That's probably some of the best advice I could ever give you guys out there. Not even anything to do with just Dungeons and Dragons. Nothing will kill a game quicker than a bloodthirsty DM not telling his players exactly what's in store for them and then just TPKing their party. The amount of horror stories I've had, and I know fellow players have had, from just DMs or other players that just failed to communicate, it's like one of the #1 game killers, guys. How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Fraud on the Telly. Today we're talking about something very important and a bit controversial in D&D. Today we're talking about player character death. It's one of those realities in the game, but you don't really realize how hard it can be on both player and dungeon master until you've experienced it yourself from both sides. So that's why today on Fraud on the Telly, I'm going to be giving you guys my advice for how to deal with death in your Dungeons & Dragons game, whether from a player or a dungeon master perspective, and yeah, just giving you my advice on how I deal with the situation. As always, guys, if you enjoyed the video or learned something new, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get right into it, shall we? So, death. It's one of those constants of life, isn't it? And it goes the same in Dungeons and Dragons. The only difference in Dungeons and Dragons is there's this advanced thing called magic. Resurrection magic, to be specific, which makes death and the permanence of death oftentimes feel like it doesn't mean anything. Now, ultimately, how death is dealt with in your Dungeons & Dragons game kind of comes down to either your DM or their relationship with the players, so that's why Session 0 is extremely important. You've probably heard like a million YouTube dungeon masters bang on about the importance of Session 0, and it really is super important, specifically in my opinion, for going over just what the tone of your game is going to be. What is the expectation between all of the players? You see, not all of us who play D&D together have been friends for like 10 plus years and have been professional actors together and know everyone's kind of inner feelings. A lot of times we play D&D with people we barely even know, and everyone plays D&D differently. Everyone has different levels of respect and boundaries, so that has to be established ahead of time. For me as a dungeon master, I know that I generally enjoy DMing a bit more of a darker, more gruesome-esque setting. My campaigns are generally a more deadly than the average 5e campaign, which, to be fair, isn't that hard to do, because personally I want to create a story, a narrative, and a world where it feels like my player's character's choices actually matter. There are consequences for the player's choices, both good and both bad. Resurrection is still possible in the world, but it is much harder than in traditional 5e. You have to roll a check, kind of like how Mercer does in Critical Role. Imagine, though, the absolute awkwardness in my game if we never had this conversation, you and I, and your player character died in my game, and now all of a sudden you're upset because it's not just that easy to revive you. Let's say your cleric casts Revivify on your dead character, but I've implemented a check system into my game and you fail and your character dies. Now you're upset at me because I didn't tell you ahead of time because you just thought your character was going to get revived. Situations like this happen all the time when a little bit of communication beforehand could have easily solved a lot of these problems. That's probably some of the best advice I could ever give you guys out there. Not even anything to do with just Dungeons and Dragons. Just communication in general solves 90% of problems. Most problems are caused by a lack of communication and continue because of a lack of communication. Me as a DM, I want to make sure I'm on the same page with my expectations on how the game is going to be played, what my expectations are for the players, and so they know, hey, is this campaign going to be super deadly? Let's say, for example, we're playing a Ravenloft game, a Curse of Strahd game. Now, arguably, Curse of Strahd is a pretty decently deadly campaign setting for 5e especially. It has the potential to be run extremely deadly. Before we begin, I want to make sure that's okay with my players. Make sure we let them know that, hey, resurrection is possible in this world, but it is much harder than in your traditional, I guess, 5e Dungeons and Dragons game. Are you okay with that? That being said, players are fickle little creatures sometimes, and even if you communicate this with them, in the moment when their player character is killed, all of that information a lot of times goes out the window, and there's just raw emotion there. I completely get that. Losing a character in D&D, especially one that you get attached to, it's a very strange thing. It almost feels like losing a part of yourself, or like losing a loved one in many ways. Now, that's a bit dramatic, a bit hyperbole, but it is a really odd sensation, and it goes the same as being a dungeon master. It doesn't ever feel good to kill a player. If you feel good killing some of your players, maybe you shouldn't be a dungeon master, but that's just my opinion. I don't want to feel like I'm cutting my players' characters' stories off short, especially when the stories that they're telling are really good. A lot of times, personally, I'll take the Matt Mercer method, where if a player wants to resurrect their character after they've died, and they come to me and talk to me about it, I'm more than willing to create a space, carve out some kind of a quest to make it more feasible, at least to give them the ability, the attempt to resurrect the character. As well, players, if you are super attached to your character and their story, and you're invested in the story that your character is telling, and they die and you want to continue that story, resurrection isn't the only way to do that. You can simply make a new character that slots into the existing story you've created for your previous character super easily. Whether that's a long-lost relative, a brother, a sister, a coworker, anything. There's so many ways you can get with your DM to link a new character into your old character's story. Now, of course, there's going to be some hard-ass DMs out there who are completely unyielding when it comes to player character death, and for those out there, I'm sorry, unless you are looking for that type of experience, that can be hell. I've experienced a DM like that before who didn't give his players ample warning about how deadly the campaign was and the fact that resurrection magic was basically non-existent in the game, and it can be a bit jarring. Now, luckily, I like kind of the hardcore nature of the game, and I simply built a character that was super hard to kill to try to get around this problem, but for a lot of people, this is just not the type of D&D you want to play. We gotta remember that everyone plays this game differently, and that's okay. At the end of the day, one of the hardest things with Dungeons & Dragons is, one, finding a group that doesn't eventually die, and two, finding a group that you feel like you fit in with. My advice to the players, if you are a player character who's just had their character die, talk to your DM. As well, it's always good to have a backup character planned ahead of time. Generally, when I'm a player in a game, I always make 2 characters right off the bat. I try to come up with 2 relatively interesting ideas for characters, one that I feel kind of attached to and enamored with. So on the off chance if one character dies, 1, I'll have a backup, 2, I'll be interested in the backup character, and 3, the backup character oftentimes only has to be temporary. As a DM, something you can do for a player who really wants their character back is give them that opportunity. Send their party on a quest to revive them, whether they need to obtain some kind of special jewel from the crypts of a dead sorcerer in order to revive them, or whether they need to venture up into a mountain to talk to an ancient priest who only has the magical power in the area to do revivification magic. Whatever it is, that character death is some of the most powerful roleplay that you can use in your story. I mean, if you just take a look at the history of Critical Role and the several player character deaths they've taken over the course of the campaigns, it's really made a lasting impact on the story and on the characters. Player character death presents us with narrative options and narrative paths that we never saw coming. This is the type of roleplay that personally I live for. It's the stuff that you get crazy invested in. It's the stories that you don't see coming that kind of form out of nothing. Some of these best stories come from the deaths of player characters. One final piece of advice I will give for my DMs and players out there. Players, if you are thinking about quitting your campaign because your player character died, then you should probably quit. DMs, if you have a player who is threatening to leave your game because their character isn't being revived or can't be revived, you should kick them out of your game. As well, that being said, in reverse, if you are a player and you approach your DM and they are just hardline no on your character being revived, and it really kind of rubs you the wrong way and not like a respectful way, you can always just leave that game. At the end of the day, if you're a player character and the only reason you're invested in the game is for your character's story, and now that that story is gone, you don't want to play anymore, you might as well get out. Role-playing tables are a community experience. They are fun together and storytelling together. It's not a one-man show, even though a lot of people act like it, whether they realize it or not. It's about the community group experience. In conclusion, players, if your character dies and you want to revive that character, have a conversation with your DM about it. See if that's something that is feasible for them to do, possibly a quest that could be set up with your party to revive your character. Also, look at bringing in a different character to tell the same story of your previous character. As well, always prepare backup characters, in my opinion, because it makes losing your main player character way less painful because you have another story that you can become invested in. DMs, please, for the love of God, have session zeros and talk about expectations for your campaign, specifically death and resurrection. It's one of the most important and potentially game-breaking sections of a D&D game. Nothing will kill a game quicker than a bloodthirsty DM not telling his players exactly what's in store for them and then just TPKing their party. If you're gonna make things challenging, if you want to feel like player character choices have meaning, have effect on the world, and thus death has meaning, you need to let them know ahead of time, because some people, well, they're just not ready for it, especially with how the kind of vanilla nature of 5e is right now. At the end of the day, D&D is a community experience that can really teach people communication skills if they're willing to learn. The amount of horror stories I've had, and I know fellow players have had, from just DMs or other players that just fail to communicate, it's like one of the #1 game killers, guys. Let me know in the comments down below, have you ever had any horror stories of a DM who was super deadly and didn't tell you ahead of time? Vice versa, DMs, let me know in the comments down below. Have you ever had players threaten to leave the game because their character wouldn't be revived? Personally, I'd kick that player so fast they didn't even know what they saw coming. As always, guys, if you enjoyed the video, learned something new, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to check out some of our other D&D and Critical Role content. And as always, guys, I hope to see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. Peace, love, adieu.